Beneath the glamorous surface, Marilyn Monroe hid a secret recording so raw it would have dismantled the Hollywood machine in a single night. This is the forbidden confession of the woman the cameras were never allowed to see the night the blonde bombshell finally broke, and a humble taxi driver became the only person to hear her true voice. The night began with a sound the world was never meant to hear: the sharp, jagged scritch of heavy vellum paper being torn from a leather binding. While the world spent 60 years searching Marilyn Monroe's red diary for scandals to topple the White House, the most powerful pages were already gone. They weren't stolen by the CIA, nor were they suppressed by the FBI. They were torn out by the star herself to protect a miracle. These missing entries didn't contain political dirt or nuclear secrets. They contained the evidence of a midnight flight to a stranger that would have redefined her legend forever. Outside the Brentwood home, the Los Angeles rain tapped against the window pane like 1,000 restless fingers, but inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, metallic scratching of a fountain pen. The air in the house was stagnant, smelling of expensive floral arrangements, stale champagne, and the sharp, ozone tang of the recording equipment she had begun to suspect was hidden behind her mirrors. In the amber glow of a single lamp, Marilyn reached for a leather-bound volume hidden beneath a floorboard in her dressing room, a diary in a shade of red so deep it looked like a beating heart. Its pages contradicted every official report ever opened by the men who claimed to know her. While the Warren Commission and the shadow men of Washington would debate the tragedy of her final hours for decades, this book held a private triumph, a secret so powerful it made her public life seem like a pale, flickering shadow. By 1962, every move she made was analyzed by lenses, and every word weighed by men in dark suits who viewed her as a commodity, a distraction for a restless nation. But as she opened the diary, the Marilyn persona dissolved. She ran her thumb over the gold clasp, realizing these records could topple empires. Yet, she hadn't started this journal to track political scandals or the secrets of the Kennedy brothers. It was a map of her survival, a desperate attempt to keep her footing in a world of shifting sand. She needed somewhere to anchor her soul. The diary was filled with poetry, fears, and the names of the few people who saw a human being instead of a polished mirror. That night, her hands trembled. Her life had become a gilded cage. While the world obsessed over her beauty, this red book was the only place she was truly free. Every other house she had lived in was a set. Every other room was a stage designed by a studio head. Here, in the ink and the shadows, she was real. As she turned the pages, the scent of Chanel No. 5 rose from the paper, a haunting reminder of the persona she was forced to maintain. She thought of the powerful men who walked the halls of the White House, claiming to love her while they plotted her containment. They were all looking for a piece of the legend, assuming this diary was a weapon she might use if cornered. They had no idea the most important entry had nothing to do with them. Marilyn looked at the empty lines waiting for tonight's entry. She wasn't thinking about the president. She was thinking about a promise made to a boy the world had forgotten. While the phone on her nightstand hummed with the impatient, vibrating energy of Washington calls from Bobby, calls from the studio, calls from lawyers, it was a simple, crinkled envelope from a small town in Ohio that made Marilyn's heart stand still. The stationery was inexpensive, the kind bought at a local pharmacy, and it smelled of lavender and old cedar. It was a world away from the heavy, embossed cardstock of the invitations that cluttered her mahogany desk. She sat on the edge of her bed, the silk of her robe whispering against her skin, and began to read a mother's plea. The handwriting was cramped and earnest, the script of someone who had spent a lifetime working with their hands in a kitchen or a field. Every stroke vibrated with a desperate, final hope. The letter was from Martha, a woman with a raw, maternal strength that Marilyn recognized from her own fractured childhood. Martha wrote about her son, Jimmy, a 19-year-old soldier who had returned from overseas with a body no longer able to sustain the spark of life. The doctors used cold, clinical words to describe his incurable condition, but Jimmy didn't talk about the end. He talked about the blonde angel he had seen on a flickering, grainy screen during a USO show in a muddy field far from home. To that young man, Marilyn Monroe wasn't a figure of desire. She was hope personified. She was the reminder that there was still beauty in a world that had shown him so much darkness in the trenches. He spoke of her as a long-lost friend who understood the weight of the shadows he carried. Martha explained that Jimmy's greatest wish wasn't to meet a politician or a general. He simply wanted to know if the woman with the gentle voice was real. He wanted to tell her that her smile had been the only thing that kept him breathing during the coldest nights in the foxholes. As Marilyn read the words, "He is slowly passing away, and he calls your name in his sleep," she felt an ache no amount of fame could soothe. She looked at her reflection in the vanity mirror, the perfectly arched brows, the painted lips, the eyes that had been trained to sparkle on command, and saw the girl from the orphanage who knew exactly what it felt like to be forgotten. She saw the little girl who dreamed of being saved by a mother who never came, and she realized she was now the only person in the world who could do the saving for Jimmy. If you believe that a single act of kindness is more powerful than fame, hit the like button right now to help this story reach more people. Marilyn was about to risk everything for a stranger. If you believe that a single act of kindness is more powerful than fame, hit the like button right now to help this story reach more people. It is the only way we can bypass the shadow men of the algorithm. The elite in Hollywood and Washington used her for her image, but this boy in Ohio needed her for her heart. The problem was that Marilyn was under constant, 24-hour surveillance. She was a bird in a gilded cage, watched by the studio, the press, and the federal agents who parked their black sedans at the edge of her property. To go to him meant breaking every rule, defying the men who thought they owned her, and risking a scandal that could end her career. But as she gripped the letter, she knew she couldn't let that young man pass into the great beyond, believing the world was a cold, uncaring place. She had been searched for her whole life, but now she had a chance to be the one who did the finding. She stood at the window, watching the rain, knowing that a quiet room thousands of miles away held the only audience that truly mattered. The city of Los Angeles below was a labyrinth of lies and transactional relationships, but in the heart of the country, a truth waited for her that required her to step out of the spotlight forever. She watched the droplets race down the glass, feeling the clock ticking toward a choice that would define who she really was. She could stay in the safety of Brentwood, or she could become the miracle a sick boy was praying for. The stakes were higher than anyone knew because the shadow men didn't just want her diary, they wanted her soul, and that was the one thing she could no longer give them. The golden girl of Hollywood didn't leave through the front door where the flashbulbs waited like hungry eyes. Instead, she slipped through the servants' entrance into the midnight air, her breath hitching as the humidity hit her. Wrapped in a dark, oversized trench coat and a heavy silk scarf that obscured her famous features, the most famous woman on the planet was now a quiet traveler embarking on a journey no studio head would ever allow. She moved with exhilarating purpose, her heart pounding a rhythm of rebellion against the life she was expected to lead. The cold night air hit her like a physical slap, a sensory shock that made the world feel real again after years of being wrapped in cotton wool. As the car pulled away, Marilyn noticed the dark sedan of the shadow men idling at the corner, its headlights off. The glint of moonlight off their windshield was a silent threat, a reminder that she was never truly alone. She felt a surge of adrenaline as her driver, a man named Eddie who had driven her for years and saw her as a daughter, took a sharp, aggressive turn through a narrow alley. The tires screamed against the wet asphalt, a sound of defiance. They were being hunted. Every second mattered. The silence in the car was heavy with the threat of history. She watched the dark sedan fade into the mist through the rear window, successfully evading the watchers for now. But she knew they would realize she was gone soon. The drive to the private airfield was a blur of neon streetlights and empty boulevards. Marilyn sat in the back, clutching a simple leather handbag and the red diary, feeling a liberation she hadn't known since she was a child running through the hills of California. She wasn't a star with a retinue of publicists. She was a woman on a mission of mercy. At the airfield, she climbed the narrow metal stairs of a small, unassuming jet tucked in a dark corner of the tarmac. The wind whipped at her coat, stinging with the sharp scent of jet fuel and sea salt. She gave the pilot a genuine smile, a smile that wasn't for the camera, but one that finally reached her eyes. As the engines roared to life and the plane lifted into the black sky, she looked down at the sprawling, artificial lights of Los Angeles, a city that had taken as much as it had given. She thought of Jimmy, waiting in a small room in a town she'd never heard of, and she felt a sense of peace. The world thought she was untouchable, a goddess carved from light, but she was just a person who had survived 1,000 storms and still had love to give. Above the clouds, she watched the moon follow the wing, a silent companion into the unknown. She opened the red diary to a fresh page, the ink from her pen gleaming in the dim cabin light. She didn't write about the fear of being caught or the threats from Washington. Instead, she wrote a single sentence: "I am going to see a friend." In Hollywood, everyone was a contact, a lead, or a rival. But thousands of feet above the earth, she was just a woman visiting a boy who saw her for who she was. The ink flowed easily, as if the diary itself were relieved to hold a story unburdened by the expectations of the powerful. The clouds below looked like a silver ocean, separating her from her old life. Somewhere in the heart of the country, a mother held her son's hand, unaware that the answer to her prayers was currently soaring through the stars. Marilyn leaned her head against the window, watching the constellations, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like an icon. She felt like a human being with a purpose. The air inside the hospital in Ohio was thick with the suffocating, chemical scent of antiseptic, the rhythmic, metallic hiss of an oxygen tank, and the sterile smell of floor wax. The hum of machines counted down the seconds of a fading life. Marilyn stood at the threshold of room 312, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had entered rooms filled with the roar of 10,000 people, rooms filled with the most powerful men on earth, but this silence was more powerful than all of them. It stripped away the artifice of the screen and left only the raw, daunting reality of human existence. She pushed the door open gently. The hinges let out a tiny, high-pitched protest. Inside, the room was bathed in the blue, ghostly glow of a heart monitor, casting long, skeletal shadows over a boy who looked far too young to have seen the horrors of war. Jimmy lay propped by thin pillows, his breathing labored and jagged, a sound of a clock winding down. His mother, Martha, was slumped in a vinyl chair, her face lined with the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights and the weight of a grief that hadn't even fully arrived yet. As the golden-haired woman stepped into the flickering blue light, Martha's eyes widened. She didn't scream. She didn't ask for an autograph. She simply breathed out a name in a whisper that sounded like a prayer. Marilyn placed a single finger to her lips, a silent plea for quiet, and approached the bed with the grace of a dream. She didn't stay in the shadows or keep her distance. Pulling a wooden chair close to the bed, she took the young man's hand. His skin was cool and thin as parchment, the blue veins visible beneath like a fragile map of a life nearly spent. But as her fingers closed around his, Jimmy's eyes fluttered open. He stared for a long, unblinking moment, his mind likely drifting between the haze of medical treatment and the memories of the movies he'd watched in the trenches. Then, a flickering smile touched his lips. A smile so pure it made Marilyn catch her breath. "I knew you were real," he whispered, his voice a dry, dusty rasp. "I told the boys in the unit. An angel wouldn't just stay on a screen." Marilyn felt something fracture deep inside her, not with pain, but with a profound sense of relief. For a decade, she had been a product, a piece of meat, a dream for men who never bothered to learn her real name. But in this sterile, quiet room, this boy saw her soul. He saw the woman, not the image. She leaned in close, the scent of her jasmine perfume filling the small space and masking the smell of the hospital. She spoke to him not as a superstar giving a quote, but as a sister who understood what it meant to reach the end of a journey before truly having the chance to live. She told him of the ocean at Brentwood, how the Pacific hums a low lullaby every night, and how the sand feels like warm grit between your toes after a long walk. She described the gulls calling in the morning and the beauty of a world that was still turning for him. She spoke of simple, earthly joys, the tart taste of a fresh peach, the crackle of a record player in a quiet house, the way a good book could take you to a place where no one could hurt you. To Jimmy, whose world had shrunk to these 4 white walls, Her voice was a lifeline, a golden thread pulling him into a landscape of peace. For the next hour, the world outside the studios, the shadow men, the headlines ceased to exist. There was no White House and no looming scandals. There was only a woman giving the gift of her presence to a boy who had given everything for a country that barely knew his name. She sat in the stillness, holding his hand as if her own vitality could prevent him from slipping away. The monitor continued its steady, clinical beep, but it felt less like a final count and more like a heartbeat, a reminder that life was still unfolding in its most beautiful, poignant form. The bedside lamp cast a soft, golden halo around Marilyn as she leaned forward, her face just inches from Jimmy's. "Tell me what the world looks like," Jimmy whispered, his eyes fixed on hers with a desperate clarity. "Because I'm afraid I'll never see it again, and I want to take the memory with me." In that quiet room, the woman who had spent her entire life being told exactly what to say by directors and publicists finally found words that came from her own heart. If you could say one thing to Marilyn Monroe today, knowing the weight she carried, what would it be? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one of them. She didn't give him a movie monologue. She painted a picture of a future as bright as a California sunrise, speaking of things she had never told a reporter or a lover. For 30 minutes, she gave the greatest performance of her life for an audience of one. She didn't talk about the glitz of the Oscars or the parties at the Waldorf. She described a meadow of wild poppies she had seen once as a girl, where the orange petals danced in a breeze that tasted like salt and wild honey. She spoke of how the morning mist clings to the canyons in the early hours, and how the Pacific Ocean feels like a heavy, blue blanket that can wash away any sorrow. To Jimmy, every word was a treasure, a vibrant color splashed against the gray, clinical canvas of his illness. He listened with an intensity that made Marilyn feel like the most important person in the universe. In that moment, she was his lighthouse, the only thing keeping him from the dark. She told him he was a hero, not because of the medals or the battles, but because of the kindness he still carried in his eyes after everything he had seen. She whispered about a place where there was no more pain or loneliness, where the sun always felt warm on your shoulders and you never had to be anyone but yourself. Martha stood by the window, tears streaming silently down her face as she watched the most famous woman in the world act as a vessel of pure grace. Marilyn wasn't just telling a story. She was building a physical bridge for Jimmy to walk across. She noticed the red diary sitting on her lap, its cover a sharp, crimson contrast to the white hospital sheets. She realized that all the secrets held within its pages, the things the powerful men in Washington were willing to use harmful force for, were nothing compared to the weight of this boy's hand in hers. The boy's breathing began to slow, becoming easeful for the first time in weeks. The fear was gone. He looked at Marilyn with a clarity that transcended his physical departure, and thanked her for showing him the light. She kissed his forehead, her own tears wetting his skin, a baptism between two souls finding truth in the dark. She promised she would never forget him and that his spirit would live on in every beautiful thing she saw. Her fame, which had often felt like a curse, was finally serving its highest, holiest purpose, offering comfort to the weary. In that moment, she wasn't the blonde bombshell. She was Norma Jean, a girl who had finally found a home in the heart of a stranger. While Marilyn was inside room 312, the world outside was closing in. The shadow men had not been fooled for long. At the end of the hospital corridor, 2 men in gray suits stood by the elevators, their presence as cold and sterile as the hospital itself. They weren't there for Jimmy. They were there for the red diary. They knew she had it with her. They had tracked the tail number of the private jet and followed the trail of jasmine and secrets to this small town in Ohio. One of the men, a career agent named Miller who had spent years monitoring the homes of stars, felt a flicker of something like respect. He had seen Marilyn in her most vulnerable moments through electronic ears, but he had never seen her do something this reckless or this brave. His partner, however, saw only a security risk. To them, the red diary wasn't a journal. It was a ledger of their own failures, a record of every conversation they had intercepted and every secret they had tried to bury. They waited in the shadows of the vending machines, watching the door to Jimmy's room. They were waiting for her to come out, waiting for the moment they could corner her and demand the book. They believed she was using this trip as a cover to hand off the diary to a contact. They couldn't conceive of a world where the most famous woman on earth would fly halfway across the country just to hold the hand of an unwell soldier. Their world was built on leverage. Her world was being rebuilt on love. Marilyn, sensing the change in the air, looked toward the door. She knew they were there. She could feel the coldness of their intent, even through the heavy oak. She looked at the red diary and then at Jimmy, who was now sleeping peacefully. She realized that if she left the hospital with the diary intact, the shadow men would eventually get it. They would take her words and twist them, or they would make the book disappear forever. She had to make a choice. She could give them what they wanted, or she could ensure that the most important parts of her life remained forever out of their reach. She reached for the fountain pen in her purse, her movements deliberate and calm. She knew she was being watched, even if they couldn't see through the walls. She began to write a final entry, a letter not to the president, but to the world she was leaving behind. She wrote about the boy in the bed and the mother by the window. She wrote about the rose she had pressed between the pages, a rose from her garden in Brentwood that she had brought as a gift for a hero. The silence of the hospital was suddenly shattered by the vibration of the telephone at the nurse's station. A moment later, a young nurse tapped on the door, looking pale. "Miss Monroe? There's a call for you," he says. "He says it's urgent." From Washington. Marilyn stood up, her silk robe rustling. She looked at Martha, who gave her a nod of support, and walked out into the hallway. The two men in gray suits straightened up as she passed, their eyes fixed on the handbag she carried. Marilyn ignored them and picked up the receiver. On the other end, there was no greeting, just the sound of a cigarette lighter clicking, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed like a gunshot in her ear. Then the voice. It was a voice that ruled from behind a mahogany desk, a voice that sounded like old money and cold marble. "The diary, Marilyn," the voice said, low and vibrating with a controlled fury. "We know you have it. We know where you are. You've had your little adventure, but it's time to come home. Do not make the mistake of thinking this boy's life, or yours, is more important than the security of this nation. Hand the book to the men in the hall, and we can forget this ever happened." Marilyn felt a wave of pity for the man on the other end. He had all the power in the world, yet he was terrified of a leather-bound book. He was terrified of a woman who had finally stopped being afraid of him. "It's just a book of poems," she said, her voice dropping into that famous, breathy whisper, the dumb blonde mask she used as a tactical shield. "Just the ramblings of a lonely girl. There's nothing in here that would interest a man of your stature. Why don't you go back to your meetings and leave us in peace?" "Don't play with me," the voice snapped. "That book contains names. It contains dates. It contains things that could burn this city to the ground. If you don't hand it over, we will find it. And we will ensure that when history remembers you, it only remembers the wreckage you left behind." Marilyn smiled to herself, a sad, knowing smile. She realized then that they would never understand. They thought the power was in the scandals. They had no idea the real power was in the 3 pages she was about to tear out. "Goodbye," she said simply, and hung up the phone. She walked back toward Jimmy's room, her head held high. As she passed the shadow men, she didn't look at them. She was no longer a victim of their surveillance. She was the author of the ending, and she was about to write a conclusion they would never see coming. Inside the room, Marilyn sat back down at the vanity. She didn't write about the man on the phone. She sat in the dark, save for the blue light of the monitor, and realized that the most powerful things she owned were the 3 blank pages at the center of her journal. She began to write, pouring every ounce of the love she had found in Ohio into the paper. She recorded the strength in Martha's eyes and the realization that being an angel for one person was worth more than being a star for millions. She felt a strange sense of finality. She reached for the gold clasp and, with a steady hand, carefully tore the 3 pages from the binding. The sound of the ripping paper was a sharp victory. These were the missing entries that would fuel 1,000 theories. They would never find them because those pages weren't destined for a vault in DC. They were destined for a mother's heart. She took the pressed rose and placed it between the torn sheets. She folded them into a plain white envelope she had taken from the nurse's station. By removing these pages, she reclaimed her soul. She was no longer a player in their game. She sealed the envelope with red wax from a candle Martha had brought, pressing her thumb into it until her own fingerprint was etched into the surface. She gave the envelope to Martha. "Keep this," Marilyn whispered. "Do not open it until I have gone, and do not let them take it. This is the only part of me that is real." Martha, sensing the gravity of the moment, tucked the envelope into her Bible. The shadow men outside had no idea that the national security threat they were looking for was now a family heirloom in the hands of a grieving mother. Marilyn walked out of the hospital an hour later. The shadow men stepped forward, but she simply handed them the red diary, the one with the missing pages. They took it greedily, never realizing they were holding a hollow shell. She flew back to Los Angeles, watching the sun rise over the desert, knowing that while her physical life was a series of storms, she had left a part of herself in a place where the sun would always shine. August 4th, 1962. The world remembers that date as a pivot point of great misfortune. But in Ohio, Martha sat at her kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where her son used to sit. Jimmy had peacefully gone only 2 days after Marilyn's visit. When she heard the news regarding the end of Marilyn's life on the radio, she didn't join the world in shock. She felt a deep, quiet connection to a woman who had given her son his final smile. She opened the Bible and pulled out the white envelope. The scent of jasmine and salt air filled the room. Inside were the 3 pages. They were the most beautiful things Martha had ever read. They weren't about politics. They were about the human heart. Marilyn had written that Jimmy was the only person who ever truly made her feel like Norma Jean again. Martha kept those pages secret for 60 years. She watched as books were written and movies were made, all of them missing the truth. She grew old with quiet dignity, knowing that she held the only part of Marilyn Monroe that wasn't for sale. In 2026, the secret finally passed to her granddaughter, Sarah. "This is the only part of her that was ever truly free," Martha told her. "You carry the truth now." Why would a woman who had the world at her feet hide her soul? Because she knew some things are too sacred to be shared with a world that only knows how to consume. The red diary is a symbol of what we think we know, but those missing pages are the map of who she actually was. Marilyn didn't leave a puzzle. She left a reminder that in a life of noise, quiet acts of love endure. She went to her eternal rest, knowing that in Ohio, a rose was safe and a mother was sleeping better. Her heart was larger than the screen could hold, and her legacy was the light she offered a single, lonely soul. If this story touched your heart, share it to remember that the most important parts of us are often kept hidden. Marilyn's heart belongs to the ones who truly needed it. The red diary is closed. The story of the woman who chose mercy over power continues. The mystery is solved not by finding the pages, but by understanding the heart that chose to tear them out. Marilyn Monroe gave the world her image, but she kept her heart for us. History is often written by the powerful, but the truth is carried by the brave. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the real story of Norma Jean. If this hidden side of Hollywood's most iconic legend moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to join our community. We uncover the human stories behind the world's biggest mysteries, the truths they tried to bury but couldn't. Don't miss our next journey into the shadows.